everybody, Rich Garcia Jr. here, and I have my second set of videos that I'm doing for the Sleep Light art frame. Unfortunately, I lost my original set of video segments for the second video, so I have to kind of cram them all into this one video. The painting's starting to look pretty full. I have a lot of dust streaks and stuff like that on a lot of the little rocks. For right now, I'm not going to do any more of the dust streaks because I don't want to fill up the painting too much. And I'm going to use the rest of any dust streaks that I had is going to be to handle reflection problems that I may have if I have some dim spots in the background. So I'm going to be covering how to prep the panels for the larger rocks here, and also I'm going to go through how to create the clusters of rocks for the smaller rocks in the background and some of the dust streaking, so that it has like kind of a realistic look without blocking out the whole painting. As you can see, the moon is kind of obscured by some of the stuff in the painting, but since these are a lot of the stuff is on its own layer, then you can actually see around all the stuff when you're looking around the painting with your eyes. So it's not too congested yet, so I'm going to see how it looks once I get the back panel done, and then I'll add more dust streaks if I have more problems with the reflections. So what I'm going to do is, when this painting is finished and ready to go into the frame, before I drill the holes for the light strips, I'm going to make sure that everything in the painting is getting enough light. And I assume that I'm going to have to add at least one more light strip, probably along the bottom, to make sure there's enough light in the painting to light all the panels up and charge them all good. I wanted to go a little bit over how I stack the panels when I decide where rocks are going. This panel actually goes behind the moon, but what I did was I put this panel, before it had anything on it, above the moon so that I could pick where I place my larger rock fragments from when the moon got blown out. So what I did is I just put dollops of paint where I thought I wanted the rocks, and then I scored the panel separately after I chose my positioning for all the larger rocks. That way I could do them all at once. And if you use paint for your positioning, what you can do is, if you turns out you don't like where it's at, you can just scrape the paint off and it doesn't damage the panel quite as bad. So let's switch these around real quick. So this panel here is going to represent the rocks directly behind the moon, and then I've got one more. And what I did with this one here is I had the smaller rocks going in clusters, so that it doesn't become like a wall of paint where you cannot see the background through it. So I diminished the amount of dust streaks and rocks on this last one because it's going to represent the last amount of dust and small rocks before you get to the background. So that represents the last two panels of the rocks. So then what I do is I'll stack the panel on top of it before I put any of these rocks or anything that are on there. I had these two rocks were here that I initially put on this panel when I was coming up with the larger rock chunks to put near the moon. And then what I did was I started to add groupings of smaller rocks to avoid that wall of paint where you cannot see the background because there's just too many rocks. Because what you're doing is you're starting with a loose arrangement of rocks, and as you're working towards the center of the painting, you're going to need to go down in the size and the density of the rocks. But if you do a bunch of small little rocks right next to each other, you're going to have that wall of paint look that you cannot really see the background very well. And it also gets in the way of the UV light penetrating all the way to the back panel. Because if you don't get good light going towards the back panel, then you're going to have a dim background, and that can cause a lot of reflection problems. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stack the panels in reverse and kind of explain the placement a little bit. So this is the first panel of rocks. It is actually on the second panel in the painting because I'm going to do just some dust streaks on the top panel with the signature to involve the top panel in the painting, but I don't like doing these kinds of rocks on the top panel because you have to do them on the back side, and they can have quite a bit different textural look to them when they're finished. So instead of doing large rocks on the very top panel to kind of tie it into the painting, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a grouping of very small rocks with some dust and hide the signature in there. This is the first set of rocks that I placed. I kind of keep them away from the edges of the panels because I don't want them to get cut in half by the frame wood, and each panel is going to sit about 1/4 inch into the frame, so you run the risk of cutting your rocks in half if you have them too close to the edges of the panel. The other thing I do is I also make sure that the rocks are not positioned too close to where the UV lights are, because what can happen is you can get this part of the rock will be really bright because of the proximity to the UV lights, and this part may not be as bright. So to avoid the half and half look, I kind of keep the rocks a little above where the UV lights are, and then what I'll do is on the next panel I'll kind of take them going in more and more towards the center. That way I can keep the rocks kind of in a grouping away from the frame, and I could put little dot stars along the frame, so that way when you're looking through at the painting, if you look past the rocks and everything, you can see very small stars on the frame edge, and that can help give your painting a much deeper look. As long as the frame isn't too lit up by reflected light, then you can get away with doing quite a bit of stars and have it give that look to where it's a distant space beyond the small section of space that you're looking at. This is the third panel here, down into the painting, and what I did was I kind of keep the rocks out to the edge still, because if you start with larger rocks right in the middle early on in the painting, you're going to kind of block your view of everything. So in order to get the very dense rock look that I'm going for, I start on the outside edges away from the center of the painting and start working my way in as I go down. This is the fourth panel here, and what I start doing too when I'm doing these paintings is I'll start numbering the panels on the handle tabs that I made. That way, no matter what I'm doing, which layers I have to paint on, I can always put it back together the right way. When you're doing the paint, it's always better to do the full set of rocks with one coat of paint, and then every time you add a coat of paint, to do every single rock on the panel, and to also, once you have enough panels to get the rocks going, you start doing each panel one layer and then switch to another panel, do a layer of all the rocks with the glow paint, and then switch to get all the paint to be the equal distribution on all the rocks so that they all look even. This fourth panel here, I started to come in towards the center with the rocks just a little bit to kind of hint at it. That way you can build the mass of rocks kind of more and more dense towards the moon without blocking your view of the background. As far as the distribution of dust throughout the painting, I tried to centralize most of it right in the line of the path of where the comet would be. The panel that goes directly above the rocks and the moon, I added kind of a thicker streak right here in the middle to kind of exaggerate that the gravity's starting to pull all the dust and little rocks into a finer line in the center of the gravity of the moon. What I did was I put it kind of thin. I didn't want to obscure the view of what's going on with the moon too much, but it does add a little bit of that reality of if you have lots of dust and you're looking through the clouds, that it does get kind of hard to see through them. So what you can do is you can do thin layers of dust streaks to kind of build on the fact that you want to have the congestion of the painting. Not so much that you can't see through it, but that you can see that there is quite a bit of dust from the moon getting blown out with the comet. The other thing that you have to be careful of is blocking the light. So what I did was, instead of having large streaks like this just in a few places, I broke up the streaks to tie in the later panels past the moon into the painting better, and some of the foreground panels by adding small little patches of dust here and there to kind of give the painting the cohesive look of like it's all in the same painting. Because if you suddenly have this stuff stop, then you're going to see it in the painting and it's going to look kind of off, because you don't want to have the wall of paint in the front, but you also don't want all the paint to just kind of suddenly stop in the back. So you need to have a couple of panels that go beyond the moon with some rocks and dust. The next panel going up from the back is going to be a panel with some smaller rocks that aren't in groupings quite the same. So this is one of the last panels that I had where it was more regular, where it's just some rocks here and there. It's not really groupings of rocks. And what I did was I had to do a transitional panel between the dust and the really small rocks and some of the larger rocks. So I kind of kept it to where I had some decently sized rocks, a few smaller ones, and then some that are slightly larger than the next panel of rocks. And I also added in some dust streaks to kind of make it a little more interesting to look at. This one over here is a black matte down for the rock. I've already went over the paint a few times to color it in nice and solid. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by putting the initial coat of white glow paint on here to start the surface. I'm going to use a small brush so I can get the edges and stuff without going too far in, since this is a fairly small rock. And then I have a general idea of what I want this rock to look like, so I'm just going to start going over towards the darker side, kind of fading it a little bit. Since I'm building the paint, that'll give me a good marker of where the edge is and what kind of shapes I can start to develop going with the paint in that direction. So this is going to take a while to dry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just keep doing coats of paint and letting them dry, and then I'll put some of the pictures up for progress pictures so you can see how it turns out. And then once it's dry, I'll go back with the micron pen and add the detail lines for the cragginess of the face of the rock. And when you get to this type of size of rock, in my painting, I have a little bit less detail. And the further away the rocks are, the less detail that you want to have on the face of them. And you're kind of stuck doing that anyways because you run out of room to put the paint on the mat. The other thing too is the larger pieces near the moon are kind of the same exact texture and look as the moon is, because I wanted to make sure you could see the parts, but I did the painting was a little more even coats along the whole side of the glow surface, whereas this is going to be, I'm going to start highlighting and exaggerating some of the edges and stuff, and then also adding the micron pen to add a little bit more detail. So this in relation to the rocks that will be further in the painting that are larger, this will have a much more rough look to the surface as opposed to the smoother, light surface of the bigger pieces towards the moon. Now that I have a few coats of paint dried up on there, I'll go through with the micron pen and I'll try to highlight some of these more interesting looking shadow spots here. And just kind of bring them up a little bit more noticeable. If you do them light enough, you don't really have to paint over them again, but sometimes if you get a little too crazy, the cracks can get a little wider than normal, or they might not look the right size for how distant the rock is. So sometimes you have to go over them with paint again. But if you did want to have like a more close-up look, you could make the lines really wide so that it looks like you're seeing into the surface a lot more. And that about do it there. So the next thing I'll do is I'll switch to using a skewer to apply the next layer of paint. And you might want to wait a few minutes to let it dry before you put the white paint on, or it might pick up the ink. Alright, so now I'm going to add the glow paint. And what I'll do is I'll put the paint on the little segments that I created with the micron pen. I use the smallest micron pen I can find. That's 005, and there's other brands, but those are the ones that I find work the best. You have to be kind of careful though, because if you're writing on the paint, it's kind of like sandpaper, and if you push too hard or get a little too aggressive with the pen, you can wear out the tip a little quicker than you want. I try to make them last as long as I can, but it is like paint or drawing on sandpaper, so it can grind down the tips of those fairly fast. This initial coat here is just going to be kind of to help diminish the micron pen lines a little bit. It's going a little too straight right there, so as an easy fix, you can just kind of put a little bit of paint over it and kind of fill in the crack a little bit and give it kind of like a different look than what you came out with the micron pen on there. And then of course this represents being a highlight from over on the other side of the rock. I'll go over these just a little bit here. A little bit more on this one too. I'm probably going to end up doing maybe like 1 or 2 more coats of paint. And what I'll do is I'll start working the excess paint over to the darker side. And of course, if you go too far and the whole rock is lit and you don't want that look, you can go back with black paint, go back over the glow paint, and then kind of fix the lighting however you want. This is going to be an explanation of some of the stuff I do for the dust streaks and the very small rocks and dust particles. I've got the board split up here. We got the top side of the panel and the back side of the panel, just to kind of keep track of what I'm talking about. When I go to flip over the panels to work on the back side, I'll always make sure I flip to the left or to the right. A couple different kinds of things you can do for the dust streaks and some of the very small rocks. You can do like a dust streak that's kind of straight like this, or you can kind of do like a larger cloud like that. And then of course you can put like what I'll do is I'll do just glow paint with no black on the inside to kind of represent like the highlighted part of the rock that you'll see. You can also put a couple here and there, you know, in the dust streaks. And then, of course, when I go to score the panel, I do a kind of light so that it's not real deep into the panel to kind of avoid having any chance of having that deep scratch highlighted by the glow paint. Because it may look out of place having a very straight line kind of mixed into like a dust streak kind of line. I do the rocks and the dust streaks on the top side first, and then if I'm going to do backside stuff, then I'll do the backside, just to kind of keep track of, you know, what side is what, because I'll do all my scoring for all the dust areas and all the small rocks, and then I'll go and paint them. But if you do the front and the back, sometimes you'll have to keep flipping it over to kind of see which side the dust streaks are supposed to be on. So I just kind of simplify it. Since I don't get to paint every day consecutively on these paintings, I kind of try to eliminate some of the keeping track problems that I tend to have. So what I'll do is I'll do the top side first, and then I'll do the back side. So when you're doing the top side and the light's coming from the left going to the right, so when you flip the panel over, you're going to want to remember that the light is going from the right to the left when you go to do your scratching for the rock placement. So what you do is, if you got so you got some rocks here like this, and then I'll do the same type of dust streak here, and then you got the angled one and then the more upright one. So what I'll do is, to keep track of the coats of paint, to make sure that the very small rocks are consistent with the amount of glow going on with the bigger rocks, then I will do it to where I do the highlight edge first on the rocks for like maybe the first 2 coats of paint. And then what I'll do is when I go for the 3rd and 4th coats of paint, I'll kind of have the paint, I'll do the edge again, and then I'll kind of use the brush to kind of make the paint kind of show that the rocks are half lit, like the moon, because you got the moon, right? And then half of it's dark. So in order to be consistent with the lighting, you're going to want to have all your rocks be half lit and not just the crescent shape. So when you flip the panel over, one of the things you can do is you can put your rocks on the back side with the mist trail going in front of it, and that can kind of add like a second layer to the highlight rocks to where they're not all just on the top side. Because one of the things that can happen, especially if you group together a lot of stuff too close, you can create the wall of paint kind of look to where if you're going deep into the painting and you start going to the last few layers of the rocks and mist, if you just have them all kind of right next to each other, it kind of gives this wall appearance, like the rocks go to a certain point and then they just stop. Or sometimes what can happen is if you have them clustered too close together, also it kind of gets in the way of seeing through the painting, and it can kind of obscure too much of the light and too much of what you're looking at and kind of make it kind of fuzzy. Because where you have the dust streaks, it's no longer going to be a clear panel that you can see through all the way without, having like kind of a foggy look. So you also don't want to put too many mist streaks all over the place too close together, because then you're going to basically clutter up the appearance of the painting with this fogginess that you can't see any of the detail through. So when you're doing the backside rocks, you're going to want to score the areas you're going to do the rocks, right? And then since these are on the backside, you're going to have to put the paint on reverse. You're going to have to start, rather than doing the black spots first when you're doing the rocks, you're going to want to do the highlights first, because you're going to put black paint on top of that to keep the highlights from having a really bad reflection problem going down into the painting. Because if you don't have the black paint, there's nothing to block the glow, and then the next panel can act like a mirror and show that. So when you're doing it, I do the same type of thing. I'll do the crescent part, the highlight edge first, and then I'll do it again, and then on the 3rd and 4th coats of paint. I generally do about 4 coats of paint. Sometimes it takes more. Depends how bright your background is and how busy it is and stuff to make these pop forward. And then what I'll do is on the 3rd and the 4th coats of paint, I'll start on the edge, but then I'll use the brush to kind of have the paint going over to the side like I did up here, except you have to do that first. And one of the things to remember is to make sure that these rocks here are as bright or maybe even a tad brighter than the top side rocks, because when you put the black paint on there, it's gonna kind of dim the glow power of the paint showing through the panel. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is to make sure that these rocks here are at least as bright or brighter than the ones on the top side. That way when you go to put the black paint on, they're not kind of dimmer lit. Now if they're behind the mist streaks and stuff like that, that may not be quite a big of an issue, because it can kind of give it the appearance that maybe the mist streak is blocking some of the lighting for the rock. But usually, as a rule, I try to always make these bright as I can. So it's a good thing also to keep track of how many coats of paint you're doing on your rocks, especially when you're doing multiple layers of rocks. That way, if you're not able to finish all the highlights for every single panel, then you can kind of keep track, on the coats of paint, so that you can get more consistent look going to all the rocks that you have in the painting, so that it looks nice and even on the lighting. Other thing you can do to make these streaks look a little more realistic in 3D is you can go and you can put the black paint kind of in the centers, kind of as like a more dense area of the clouds and streaks that aren't necessarily getting light, but you want them to kind of be in the center so that it kind of gives it like a more dense look to it. Because if you do there's a few ways to do the lights. You can do them on top of the glow paint on the top side, or you can do them first and have glow paint on the top, or you can do it to where you have them on the back side first, or you can do the streak and then put them on the back side. When you're doing the darker paint, the black paint to designate the denser stuff in the middles of this stuff, I always find it shows a lot better if you do the black streak of mist that's not going to be highlighted, and do another coat of white over top the back side. That way when you flip it over, it's kind of backlit and you can see the detail of the darker streak in the mist streaks a lot better. And of course, you know, you can do the dots inside the streaks, over top the streaks, or you can even do them on the back side too. And that way they'll kind of give more to that depth appearance of the stuff that's highlighted, instead of just having it just whatever's on the top side. The other stuff to think about is, like, when you're placing the rocks that are smaller, you don't want to have just a whole bunch of rocks on the panel in the middle, because that will also create like a wall of paint kind of look. So what I do is, once I get to the point in the painting to where there's not a lot of room between the rocks, instead of doing just a solid wall of rocks, I'll kind of do, you know, little clusters of the smaller rocks and the dust streaks to kind of you know, show that it's part of the painting easier and not the walls of paint stopping. But it kind of allows you gaps to look through to see down deeper into the painting. Because if you have a lot of streaks, you basically end up making it kind of hard to see through the painting. So you're going to want to limit how close they are together so that you have a clear view to the back panel to see the actual background. So first thing to do when you're doing it is to use a light scoring. That way you don't have really dark or really deep gouges that can, what they can do is they can create like a canyon for the glow paint and the black paint, or whichever kind of paint you're using, to kind of be stuck in, and then it's going to make like a straight line. So I always try to use real light pressure when I'm doing the scoring. That way I don't get those really, really deep gouges that can cause the paint to kind of have like an unnatural look to the shape that we're doing for the mist and the small rocks. You can do it front side or back side. So what I'm doing here is I'm just going to prep the top side here, and then I got some examples on the other side of the panel that I'll show you. But say if this is the top side, and in the painting the light's coming from the left side, when you score it, you're going to want to put the rocks for the front on top, like this here, for like a, you know, a small size. Or what I'll do sometimes is I'll just make little divot marks where I want to put some of the smaller ones. And then as long as you have a decent little divot, that should keep the paint on from falling off the panel. And with the top being most of the rocks, I'll put at least a few backside ones. And sometimes the best place to put them are next to other ones. Like if I were to put them here on this dust streak right here, I would probably do them around these groups of rocks right here, as opposed to on its own by itself. So one of the things you can do is don't worry about filling up all the rocks in one shot, because you can always add more later. So what I'll do is I'll just put a couple of dots in an area that I want to try to put some rocks on the backside also. That way I can break up the grouping so it doesn't look like it's all just flat on one panel, and it'll have the slight depth variance. The pictures won't show it very well, but definitely when you're looking at the painting face to face, your eyes will detect that there's a slight difference between what's painted on the top and what's painted on the back. This is pretty typical of the other stuff I've done so far for the rocks and everything like that. You just scratch it up and then you put the black paint down, and then, you know, go back once the paint's dry and then do the highlight parts. So this is the top side here, and the light's coming from the left like it's supposed to. And then on the back side, I went and put the highlight parts for the rocks that I'm going to have on the back side, because obviously you can't put the black paint first or you won't be able to see the highlights. So you have to start with the highlights. And what I'll do, like I was saying before, is I'll do the kind of a crescent shape, or I'll do the edge of the rock, just the very edge. And I'll do that like twice, and then I'll start building the paint away from that. That way there's more of a thick coat of paint along the very edge to kind of add to the brightness of where the light's hitting the harshest. And then it gives, more of a contour look from the highlight fading going towards the back. This stuff here is just the more blotchy type mist that I do. And when I score for that, I kind of do in a circle pattern. And that will help me keep track of what type of dust I have where. And when I get to this point, I'll know that this is supposed to be, this style of looser type of mist. When you are doing the backside, like I was saying before, you're going to put the black paint on top of it. And that's going to kind of do two things. One, it's going to not reflect any color from behind it. Like if you were to put white, the white paint will reflect the light off of the white behind it. Whereas if you're doing black, it'll kind of kill the light coming out of the paint, and it'll just be, whatever's showing from the other side that's glowing. You have to highlight all this stuff first, and you don't know if it's going to be as bright as the rocks that you already have on there unless you make sure you got enough coats of the glow paint going. But it can also affect how bright it is in comparison to other rocks, and you don't really want it to look mix match if you're trying to stay with a consistent lighting scheme. Now these ones here, there's no dust in front of them, but if they did turn out dim in comparison to the other ones, one thing I could do is I could put a little dust cloud here to kind of tell the viewer's eye that this dust here is blocking some of the light that's highlighting these two rocks. Once you have your shapes scratched in, then you go through with the glow paint. And I left one of these less done than the other one so I could show you. What I'll do is I'll go on the edge like this, and then I'll start building the paint towards the shape of the rock that's going to be highlighted but not as bright as the edge, the brightest edge on there. And that will kind of give it that more half lit, half dark look like the moon. Is you just take the black paint and you go right over the glow spot and then go a little beyond the highlights. That way you create the darker half of the rock and give it the silhouette so that you can see it. When I do the placement on these backside ones, I usually do them, like I said, near other groups of rocks to make it kind of pop out with the difference. But the other thing I like to do is I like to put them down in the dust. That way they get like almost like a foggy look to them, like you're looking through the haze of the dust. So all you got to do for that is pick a spot and then scratch through whatever paint might be there. If you got the backside painted with some of the dust, or even some of the more dense unlit dust, the black streak here. And this is just me doing the black paint that I use for the rocks, just in a little single streak in the very center of this part of the mist. That way, when you're looking at it, it kind of has a dark spot, kind of gives it another dimension to it when you're looking at it. So what I'll do is I'll go back with the glow paint, and what I'll do is I'll just kind of trace where I put the scratch like that, and then that'll be the initial coat of paint for the highlight part of the rock. And you don't always have to do round ones. I try to add some longer straight ones that look like splinters. That way you don't just get all dots everywhere. And you can do the same thing, like say the speck rocks that are just highlights. You can go back and you can also add little shorter pieces of rock that are, not exactly round. And you can just build the paint up on those too for that kind of that same appearance, to where they're so far away you can't really make out the shadow part of the rock. So you're just doing the highlights. And of course, the other thing you can do too is you can also do just the solid dots behind some of the mist also. That way it kind of looks like there's rocks in there and you can see that there's a shape, but you can't see the highlights because there's just too much dust to be able to make out the highlight for the rock between the highlight for the dust. The other thing you can do too is, since some of these on this side have just glow paint, you can actually also go back and just tap them with a little bit of the black paint to kind of give them a backside if you wanted to have like really small rocks clustered together. Now in the painting I'm going to have areas of these in spots, but I'm going to try to limit how many I have right now until I get more of the back panel done. That way I can use the mist more strategically. Instead of just having a bunch already on there, I can try to do clusters like this behind things that might be reflecting onto the panel behind it. Well, this is kind of a good way to get rid of reflection problems, so I wouldn't put too many of these in right off the bat. And you also don't want to get two things. One, the wall of paint look where you can't see through it. And then you also don't want to diminish how much light gets to the back panels. Since this painting here is going to be like 15 plus panels, it's going to be pretty deep. So I wanted to try to limit how much of this I'm doing. I'm doing it more as like just a way to kind of hint at it right now and kind of put it here and there to kind of flesh out the painting. And then once I get the back panel done, if I still have reflection problems, I'll usually use either some plain mist or some mist with groupings of rocks to help hide the reflection so that it doesn't go through to the next panel down. I'm going to go over how to add the darker backside rocks with no highlights that are going to represent rocks that are behind the lit rocks that aren't getting any of the light. As far as these are concerned, I wouldn't go too crazy. I'd put them in a few places. Not every lit rock has to have the dark rocks behind them. And of course you want to make sure that you don't have any of the rocks with no highlights that are kind of out by themselves, because they'll look out of place and they won't match the lighting scheme that you got going on. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a couple of dark rocks here on the right side where there's no light, because the light's coming from the left and this is blocking the sunlight from them. So when you flip the panel over to do this, because they're going to be on the back side, you got to remember that you're actually going to be going to the left side of this rock and not the right side. I'm just going to add one or two little rocks here just to kind of give it a little bit more of a realistic look to the lighting, so that you can see that, you know, there are objects behind it that are blocked by the larger object and don't get any of the light. And I'm just gonna add maybe like one small one just right here. And this, of course, it's the same procedure as doing the other rocks. You're just gonna skip the highlight part of it. And this is going to take a few coats of paint, just like the other ones. That way you can keep any of the light from the background from showing through, because that's going to be a pretty unrealistic look if you got rocks that don't block the light coming from the background in the bottom. And then of course for the smaller one, I'll just use the bamboo skewer and kind of drop some paint on that.